Okay, so as far as fungi, when it comes to classifying them, and it'll become more apparent as we go through the different classifications, that they're based on their colonial structure. In other words, how are the cells arranged? What do they look like, or something like that? And then based on their method of sexual reproduction. So in other words, they all have sexual reproduction. Some of them also have asexual reproduction. But as far as the sexual reproduction, what is it? What structures are formed? And then we use that structure to be part of its, like what phylum it belongs to. Okay, so here are the most common phyla that we're going to talk about. It's not all of them, but the most common ones, the ones that you may have seen at one time or another. We have the Zygomycota, the Ascomycota, and the Basidiomycota. Now, they all have this part in it, MYCO. What did we say that meant when we were talking about, like, mycology? It means what? So, yeah, mycology is a study of fungi, okay, or fungi. And so all of these phyla have this much in it that tells us we're talking about fungi. Now, the first one we're going to talk about is Zygomycota. This is the one that you've probably all seen. If you've ever seen mold on bread, you've seen an example of one from that. Our representative organism, that's typically how we study these. We look at a phylum, and then we find one of them that represents it well, that we're probably most familiar with. And the bread mole, the name for bread mole is Rhizopus, and then that's kind of like its genus name, and then it'll have something after it. There's one kind of bread mole that's black, so it would be Rhizopus nigra. They have different colors, but in general, bread mole is Rhizopus. Its form of sexual reproduction is that it forms a zygospore, so we call it zygosporangia. And so can you see where they're taking the zygote, putting it in front of the fungus, and coming up with the phylum name. Now, if you, this down here, let's imagine this is bread down here with the little bubbles in the bread. And the zygote, or the Rhizopus bread mold, this would be bread mold kind of growing into the surface of the bread. What are these root-like structures on them called? We had that yesterday. What are the root-like structures called? Yeah, okay, hypha is kind of like the general name. What do we call special hypha that look root-like, and they kind of serve to attach and absorb moisture? I'll give you a clue. It's on the slide. Okay, those are rhizoids, right? Rhizoids are like the hypha that function like roots for attachment and getting nourishment and stuff like that for the whole fungus. Now, it is capable of reproducing asexually by just generating spores straight from the sporangia. And so then these spores would land on the bread, and they could also make more mold on your bread. Okay? They also have a sexual form of reproduction. The sexual form of reproduction does kind of sound similar to some things that we've talked about before, where, remember we talked about we'd have two filaments next to each other, and then they would sometimes grow a little conjugation tube, a little tube in between, and share their genetic material. Well, that's kind of what's happening here. So they both do it. The one we looked at earlier, they would just have one grow from one side to the other and then give its genetic material. Here, they're both providing genetic material. So these extensions on the hypha are going to actually join each other and form a structure right here that we called a zoosporangium. And that zoosporangium can grow into a new fungus. So here, and what it does is it does similar to what seeds do. You know, it can germinate. So if this, you know, then will grow up above the ground and form all these other structures. You know, they have to have the rhizoids, the little root-like structures, and then eventually they'll grow the stuff that comes up above the, called the sporangia, and capable of reproducing asexually. And then maybe after it's more mature, it can go through this phase. So it has both means of reproducing. This one just produces spores directly, and so the new fungus is going to be genetically identical to the original, the parent cell, or group of cells, or colony of cells. These will have some differences. Now, one of the things we do want to point out is that these two, maybe that are growing near each other, are from different, could be on different fungi. You know, like this one's from this one, and this one's from that one. This is a, what was that little runner-like thing that goes from one to the other, and it starts with an S? And we said strawberries do the same thing when they reproduce themselves asexually. Second letter is a T. Remember stolen? Okay. So you can see the stolen. So these two are going to be genetically identical. These maybe are genetically identical, but these might not be. And so it talks about different mating types. One comes from one fungus, one from the other fungus. And they're going to share their genetic material, form a zygosporangium. And that structure then, that is a zygote. That's why we call it zygosporangium. It's a zygote. Zygote has genetic material from both fungus, I can't call them plants, but fungus, and it's now genetic, you know, back to like the diploid thing. Okay, now let's talk about another phylum of fungus. They're called the sac fungus. The asco is more the sac idea behind it. We were talking about that in a previous class. Does anybody happen to know the name? I thought the people I asked in that period might know that name. You know, like, you don't see that as much anymore, but I know that you see pictures more in the past of Navy sailors. They would have this white cap on their head that it comes over their head like this, and then you could fold it up around, and it's all, you know, I think there's a picture on our wall of warriors out there that somebody's wearing that. I think it's a relative of Caitlin Holloway's that has that. Does anybody know what they're called? What those caps or hats are called? I thought it had something to do with the beginning of that name, like Asco something, but I don't know. That's what I always thought it was, but I might be wrong. Now, sexual reproduction, instead of having a zygospore, like the previous one had, this one has an ascospore, and this structure is not a sporangium, but this one is an ascus, okay? And it produces, kind of goes through the sexual reproduction in a similar way. It's not growing on bread. This one looks like it's just growing out in the forest somewhere. Probably growing off the dead, decaying leaves and maybe stuff like that that you find on the forest floor. Okay? And then they do a asexual form as well called conidiophores. So let's look at how that is. The sexual part is right here. We're going to have different mating types again, like we had on the other. They're going to share their genetic material, and they're going to form these ascites over here. These ascites. You know, eventually you'll have a whole bunch of them like this, and then it will break apart, and each of those structures right there is going to be an ascospore. Okay, but they're all doing the same thing. It's just that we give them different names because they're different species of fungus. But they all kind of do they're doing the same thing, but it kind of looks a little different how they go about it. But they're accomplishing the same thing. And these ascospores, instead of zygospores, these ascospores will then grow into another one, can germinate and become another one. Okay? But we're making, this is sexual reproduction, so there's going to be allow genetic variability. In other words, it could be, they're not all identical to each other. Okay? And that's just showing them germinating like in the other one. So, as you can see similar steps in all of those. They just call the parts different names. Quite often they give it's just the beginning of the name that's different. Or the structure it forms in is different. This is the asexual part of it. This was like the bread mold was the part that was growing up above ground, or above the bread. This is the same thing. So instead of it, you know, these mating types here, this will grow a structure up here, and it's kind of like the sporangia, isn't it? If you take all of these things away, it doesn't have kind of like the same shape as a sporangia. And then these structures that grow out to the side are the conidiophores. Like we had sporangiophore, this is conidiophore. Okay? And oh, let's finish that up. I think we forgot something. And they will produce these conidia, or spores, that will again germinate and grow into another fungus. That's how they spread themselves. This part is the part that sticks up above the rest of the fungus. That's why they call it an aerial hypha or hyphae, because it sticks up above. Okay, it's not still inside of whatever it's decaying, living off of. It's actually raised up above that so that these spores can spread. The other one kind of does it underneath, and it spreads kind of under, you know, in the dead decaying matter. Now, what are some organisms that you may have heard about? Remember, we have talked about penicillium. This is grows, where we first found it was on those auger plates that had bacteria growing on it, and then we found some places where the bacteria wouldn't grow, and it's because a spore from penicillium landed on the auger, and it started to grow, and it releases chemicals that we use as antibiotics to prevent bacteria from reproducing, growing and reproducing. So that's it. That penicillium mold that we often refer to it, that grows on the auger plate, is an example of this kind of fungus, an ascomycota. Okay? There are also the powdery mildews. You may or may not see this. Sometimes in gardens, you might see this where I've heard that this is sometimes because the maybe you water above ground. You know, like some people water their gardens by spraying on the whole garden, and if it's kind of like warm and humid, you might get this powdery mildew growing on the leaves of plants. Okay, and that's going to affect the produce, or how much produce is actually produced by that plant in the garden. Then there's yeast. Okay, so when we did the lab with the yeast fits into this. We said it was a fungus. but it belongs to this phylum, Ascomycota. Now, the last phylum that we're going to talk about, of the common ones, is what we call club fungi. They have a sexual reproduction. Okay? The structure that the spores are made in this time is called a basidium. Okay? It has a different name. And the spores that are produced are called basidiospores. So we've had zygospores and ascospores, and now we have basidiospores. So they all have spores. They all are made in their own structure, and the structure has a different name because they have different shapes. This particular fungus, we've never found out if they're capable of reproducing asexually. Okay? They're not capable of reproducing asexually, as far as we know. Now, let's take a representative example of this, and that would be like a regular mushroom that you might see popping up in your yard, or you can think about maybe ones that you buy in the store that you want to eat. So in here, this part of the mushroom that sticks up is that basidium that we were talking about before. The whole structure could be called a basidiocarp. Underneath it, we said the cap of the mushroom are little fins or gills. And on these fins or gills, you see these structures. So in other words, this is would be these fins that we're talking about. They're very thin. And then growing off to the side of that are these structures right here. That's called the basidium, okay? Where the spore is actually produced. Up here, you're going to have, notice that where you have these growing together again and uniting their genetic material, and then this thing will then germinate, and I'll have another mushroom that can grow from that. Now, some of these, are just huge. They can grow. I think in your book it talks about how big they can grow. There's some of them that are actually, they think are really quite old, that have been growing out for like hundreds of years maybe. So they're just all part of one structure that just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So the spores they produce, because it forms in a structure called a basidium, we call them basidiospores. Okay? Still do the same thing. They then, if they land on wherever they grow, this would be, like for instance in my yard, I will see it either growing in the grass. It's usually where I see it growing, but they're stuck in the grass. When the leaves, some of the leaves of the grass die and break off and land on the ground, they start rotting and decomposing, and the mushrooms will grow in that. They like that dead, decaying matter. Remember, they're decomposers. Okay, so what are some other representatives? Well, obviously the mushrooms, like we talked about. Have any of you seen these in the forest? Ever been hiking around in the forest? They're kind of leathery, aren't they? Kind of whitish, leathery-like. They almost look like a rock at first when you see them. But when you touch them with your foot, I guess you can have them in your hand if you want to. But when you touch them with your foot, they're not solid like a rock. They're flexible a little bit. And what happens when you stomp on them? You ever stomped on them? Okay, when you stomp on them, they will break open because all these spores are formed on the inside of this one structure. On the mushroom, they're formed on the underside of that. Here, these are all formed on the inside, and when you stomp on it like that, out comes this black dust that goes spreading out. Those are the spores that it's produced. That goes spreading out, and they'll make some more puffballs out. So, if they naturally break open, on their own, I don't know how far the spores are, but, some animal stomps on it, or you stomp on it, it goes flying everywhere. But it's like a black powder, but the spores are quite often have this black look to them. Let's see. You've probably seen these if you've been out in the forest. You'll see those growing on the bark. Because remember, the bark of a tree is dead. Okay, bark of a tree is dead, and so these bracket fungi is what we call these. Will grow on there. Look like little shells growing on the outside. Some of them can be quite large. I've seen some of them that, like this part right here, might be about this far across, like a shelf, and it has almost like gills on the bottom side of it where it makes the spores. Now, sometimes you see it, growing on logs that have already fallen down too. But this would be on a tree that's still standing upright. Now, usually if you see a lot of this growing on a tree that's upright, that's not a healthy tree. It usually...
I need jazz.
Or?
Dance.
Dance, okay. Yeah, I know that when we went to Camp Calvert Crest for our very first missions trip, the team or crew I worked with the whole time I was there was a bunch of seniors that with chainsaws, and we were cutting down trees and splitting the wood so they could use it the next summer for campfires. And we did cut an awful lot of wood, but we saw a lot of trees that would have this on the outside, and those are the ones that we would cut down because they weren't healthy trees, and so we were just getting rid of them. Sometimes we would find some that actually had fallen down, and if the wood was still pretty firm, we would cut it up for firewood. But sometimes it was so far decayed and soft, that we just left it alone. We'd maybe cut out a few pieces that was worth it, but the rest of it, we're just going to let the mushrooms, the fungus, have its fun with it and completely decompose the logs. Now, this one right here is rust. Rust grows on leaves typically. Their favorite kind of leaf, I don't know if it's favorite, but the one that I see it most on is you can actually have in your lawn, if you water it too much and it's, in summer when it's really hot, that can grow on the leaves, and it will kind of, I don't know if I'd say, maybe like stunt the growth of the grass. It doesn't grow as well when that's on it because it's deriving nourishment from the leaf instead of using its nourishment to grow bigger. So it could be on what we call like the cereal grains, like wheat and oats and barley and rye and things like that can have rust on it. And it's a fungus. And so farmers have to decide, how am I going to handle that? Is the amount of rust I have in my field small enough that, yes, it's going to reduce the yield of my crop, but it's maybe doesn't cost us, or I won't lose as much money as it might cost me to try to get rid of it. Now, if they determine, there's a lot of rust out in this field, and if I don't do something, I may not have any crop, then they will hire a sprayer, usually in the form of an airplane, that will spray the fungicide on the whole crop, and it will kill the rust. And then the leaves can go back to making food that they ultimately want to put into seeds as opposed to feeding a fungus. Now, have anybody seen this? This is ear of corn. Anybody seen this? Sometimes you'll see this when you buy sweet corn, but not necessarily, like buy it at a grocery store, but you might buy this at like a roadside stand or a farmer's market or something like that. And when you husk, take the leaves off the corn, you will sometimes see this growing underneath that, And that is a fungus growing, and it's driving its nourishment from the kernels of corn. And it's called smut. Okay? Not a good thing. You don't want to eat that. I mean, sometimes if we would do that, we might cut the corn cob right here, just cut off the part that's smut, and just eat the rest of it. But a lot of times we just throw the whole ear of corn away. But that's a fungus. So it's in the same category as mushrooms. It's just growing on the corn kernels as opposed to the forest floor or a dead tree or a leaf or something like that. This one, I don't know that I've ever seen that. But it's another kind of fungus that you can find out in the forest. Okay, the last thing that it talks about in your chapter are perfect fungus, or perfect fungi, and imperfect fungi. The perfect fungi, we call them true fungi. Why? Is they have a known method of sexual reproduction. So the three that we took had all had sexual reproduction. So there are some others that might not. You know, if we have some are true fungus, there must be some that aren't. The other that we refer to as imperfect fungi are called imperfect because we have never observed any sexual means of reproduction in them. They just do the asexual kind only. They have to reproduce themselves somehow, so it's going to have to be asexually. But we have never observed any sexual type of reproduction in some fungi, so we call them imperfect fungi. Now, what would happen at some point in the future, people were studying this particular species of fungus and under the right conditions observed it carrying on sexual reproduction. Then what do we do? What would be the logical thing? Yes?
Turn it into perfect fungi.
Okay, we just move it to a different category. We move it into the category of perfect fungi. Okay? So, some of them it's easy to observe certain characteristics, and others the conditions maybe have to be right for you to be able to observe that.